Section 1. The Eternal Neighborhood. There is a street in Rhode Island that has never changed. Not in 25 years. Not across more than 400 episodes of television. The trees on Spooner Street have never grown taller. The houses have never needed new paint. The Griffin family minivan sits in the driveway with the same dents it had in 1999, and the lawn has somehow always been exactly as overgrown as it needs to be for Peter to grumble about mowing it, but never quite get around to doing so. The sky over that neighborhood cycles through seasons: snow at Christmas, heat in July, that particular gray of a New England autumn, but the people inside those houses remain precisely, impossibly the same. This is the central, foundational paradox of Family Guy. Before you ever get to time machines, before alternate universes, before a baby accidentally creating the Big Bang, you have to sit with this first, quieter impossibility. The show has been running for over a quarter century, and almost nobody in it has meaningfully aged. Think about what that means when you actually follow it to its logical end. The show premiered on the 31st of January, 1999. Peter Griffin was established early on as being in his early to mid-40s. By the real-world calendar, Peter Griffin should now be somewhere in his late 60s. Lois told us in one episode that she was 2 years younger than Peter, which would put her somewhere around 66 or 67. Meg was 15 when the show began, which means Meg Griffin, in any sensible accounting of time, would now be 40 years old. She would have a career, possibly children of her own. Chris, 13 at the start, would be closing in on 38. And Stewie, the baby Stewie, was born on the 11th of September, 1998, which we will come back to at length. Stewie, by any honest reckoning of the calendar, should be 27 years old by now. He should be finishing graduate school, or contemplating a career, or sitting in some coffee shop somewhere writing the world domination plans that his younger self could never quite execute. Instead, he is in a high chair. He is, and has been for the better part of 3 decades, 1 year old. The show operates on what television scholars and dedicated fans call a floating timeline. This is a concept borrowed from newspaper comic strips, actually, where characters like Charlie Brown and Garfield exist in a kind of perpetual present tense, always experiencing the same general stage of life, always occupying the same emotional landscape, always reacting to a world that updates around them without ever being updated themselves. The Simpsons does this. South Park does this. Even something as beloved as Peanuts did this. When you have a show that runs long enough, you face a choice. Either let your characters age and change and eventually retire or die the way real people do, or you let time slide past them like water around a stone. Family Guy chose the stone. But the interesting thing about how it made that choice is that it never made it cleanly. It acknowledged the passage of time in certain ways while ignoring it in others, and the result is a continuity so fractured and internally contradictory that trying to map it out feels less like research and more like archaeology. You keep digging and finding layers that shouldn't be on top of each other. There are Christmas episodes. There are Easter episodes. There are summer vacations and school years and new semesters. The characters reference specific real-world events. They joke about things that happened in 2005, then in 2012, then in 2020. Peter has voted in presidential elections. Brian has referenced specific moments in recent American history. The show has always been anchored to a recognizable version of the present day, and yet the characters don't age to match any of it. Some characters have aged a little. Meg went from 15 to 18 over the course of the series, though that aging happened irregularly and was mostly referenced in passing rather than shown. Chris moved from 13 to 14 at some point and then seemed to stop there. Brian, who is a dog and therefore ages on a different scale than humans, went from 6 years old at the start of the show to 10 years old at some later point, a fact mentioned in various episodes, though exactly when that transition happened is anyone's guess. Stewie had a second birthday in the 2014 episode, Life of Brian 2, Revival Reversal, 15 actual years after the show began, which means that by the show's own internal logic, roughly 15 years of real time produced exactly 1 year of story time for that character. And even that one additional birthday was a rarity, an exception in a show that generally treats time as something that happens to plots rather than to people. Here is where the paradox deepens. The show doesn't just ignore time, it actively contradicts itself about it. In one episode, Peter references something that happened 20 years ago. In another, the same event is described as happening 10 years ago. Flashbacks to the characters' pasts show different versions of the same scenes, with different details, different ages, different contexts. The Griffin's wedding has been depicted multiple times across different episodes, and it looks noticeably different each time the guests are different. The venue changes. The circumstances of Peter and Lois getting together have been told in at least 3 incompatible versions. This isn't carelessness so much as it is a structural feature of how the show tells stories. Each episode is essentially self-contained. The writers aren't building toward anything, not tracking continuity across seasons in the way that a drama would. They're writing jokes, and sometimes the joke requires Peter to have done something 20 years ago, and sometimes the joke requires that same thing to have happened 10 years ago, and the show trusts that you won't go back and check. Most viewers don't. Most viewers experience Family Guy as a series of moments rather than as a continuous narrative, and within any single moment, the show is usually internally consistent enough to work. But if you do go back and check, and there are fans who have done exactly this, with spreadsheets and timelines and color-coded charts, what you find is a neighborhood that exists outside of time. A street where the calendar pages fall but nothing changes. A family that celebrates Christmas every year but never gets any older. A baby who has been a baby longer than some of the show's viewers have been alive. The floating timeline creates a kind of dream logic for the whole show. Things happen, events occur, but nothing accumulates. Everything resets. The Griffins are always in the same house, at the same stage of life, facing the same general kinds of problems, and tomorrow or next season or next decade they will be there still, frozen in that particular American moment that the show has always been about. A working-class family in a small Rhode Island city, slightly too chaotic to be ordinary, slightly too warm to be tragic. There is something almost meditative about that when you let yourself settle into it. The permanence of Spooner Street, the unchanged faces, the eternal present. But it also means that when the show does try to anchor itself to a specific past, when it tells you exactly when something happened, or builds a storyline around a character's history, it almost inevitably contradicts something it said before. The floating timeline isn't just a creative choice. It's a generator of paradoxes, and every paradox that follows in this video grows, in some way, from this original impossibility. The neighborhood will always be there, unchanged, waiting, and that is either comforting or deeply strange, depending on how long you sit with it. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you want more deep dives like this one, subscribing is the best thing you can do to help this channel keep going. Now, let's get into it. Section 2. The baby who should be in college. If Stewie Griffin were aging normally, he would be 27 years old right now. He was born, the show tells us, on the 11th of September 1998. The pilot episode aired on the 31st of January 1999. Which means Stewie was just a few months old when we first met him. Over the course of the first season, he celebrated his first birthday in the episode Chitty Chitty Death Bang, and he has been roughly 1 year old ever since. Not 1.5, not 2, 1. Perpetually, impossibly, entertainingly 1. This is the Stewie paradox in its most basic form, and it would be strange enough on its own even without the layers that get added to it as the show goes on. Here is a child who has been 1 year old for 27 years of real time. He sleeps in a crib, he rides in a stroller, he eats from a high chair. His mother carries him on her hip and feeds him formula and reads him bedtime stories. And yet he has built a working time machine, traveled to the Renaissance, met Leonardo da Vinci, accidentally caused the Big Bang, reversed the flow of time itself, visited dozens of alternate universes, published a children's book, attended theater, dated multiple individuals, and spent meaningful portions of his life plotting to either kill his mother or take over the world, sometimes both at once. The gap between what Stewie looks like and what Stewie actually is sits at the heart of almost every joke the character has ever been part of. That gap is also the engine of the paradox, because the show keeps expanding what Stewie is capable of while refusing to update what he appears to be. He is a 1 year old with a graduate student's vocabulary, a military strategist's tactical mind, and access to technology that doesn't exist in the real world. The contrast never gets resolved. It just keeps getting wider. But the aging paradox isn't the only strange thing about Stewie's timeline. The more interesting wrinkle is what the show does with his birth. In Yug Ilimov, which is the 200th produced episode of the series and aired in November 2012, Brian accidentally causes time to flow backwards. What starts as a small malfunction in Stewie's time machine, Brian was using it to impress women at bars, which is very much a Brian thing to do, escalates into a full reversal of the timeline. Time doesn't just stop. It runs in reverse, and it runs faster and faster, accelerating like a video on rewind that someone has pressed the fast-forward button on. The effects are everywhere. People walk backwards through the streets. Cleveland, who had moved away to Stool Bend, Virginia for his own spin-off show, is suddenly living across the street again because time has rewound past the point when he left. Brian witnesses Mort Goldman placing a coin on the sidewalk and walking backward, the first sign that something is very wrong, because Mort would never voluntarily put money down. Stewie starts losing teeth he had recently grown. His ability to walk disappears. And as time continues to accelerate backward, Stewie is carried to the hospital, pushed back into his mother's womb, and nearly unborn. Think about that for a moment. The show's timeline, if reversed, would unspool Stewie's entire existence. Every adventure, every scheme, every time travel trip, every conversation with Brian, all of it would be unmade. The character who has been 1 year old for 27 real years would cease to have been born at all. Brian manages to repair the time machine at the last possible moment, and Stewie is born again, and notably, Brian is present in the hospital room, which is how Stewie gets his name. This creates a small but beautifully elegant loop. The episode about time reversing also quietly establishes that Brian was there at the very beginning, at the moment Stewie entered the world. It gives their friendship an origin point that predates even Stewie's consciousness. But the episode also raises something that can't quite be answered. If time reversed all the way back to before Stewie's birth, what happened to all the things Stewie had done? The time machine he built in Mind Over Murder, back in the first season, where a prototype version was used to avoid teething pain, did that get unmade? The events of Road to the Multiverse, where Stewie and Brian traveled to parallel universes, did those still happen? The show treats the repair of the time machine as a clean reset, everything back to normal. But normal is a slippery word in a show where time runs backwards and babies build particle accelerators. What Yug Ilimov really reveals is that Stewie's existence is the load-bearing wall of the Family Guy universe. Not just emotionally or narratively, but physically, literally, cosmically. And that brings us to something we'll come back to in a later section, which is the episode where the show makes the extraordinary claim that Stewie's time machine is responsible for the existence of everything. For now, though, sit with the simpler version of the paradox. A baby who should be in his late 20s is in a crib. His timeline has been reversed and restarted. He has visited dozens of historical eras and alternate realities. He has died in some of them. He has caused the extinction of entire branches of possibility. And through all of it, he remains one. Will always remain one. The most powerful person in the Griffin household, trapped in the body of someone who can't reach a light switch without help. There is something in that image that works its way under your skin, if you let it. The genius in the onesie. The most dangerous mind in the room, and the room is the nursery. His age is a paradox. His existence might be a prerequisite for the universe having existed at all. And every night Lois comes in and tucks him into his crib and says goodnight, with no idea what's sleeping in there. Section 3. The dog with two origin stories. Brian Griffin is a contradiction wrapped in a dog. Not just the obvious contradiction, a Labrador retriever who drives a Toyota Prius, drinks dry martinis, and once published a novel, but a deeper, structural contradiction at the level of his own history. Brian's backstory has been told more than once in the show, and the tellings don't match. Depending on which episode you're watching, Brian came from an entirely different place, arrived in an entirely different way, and has an entirely different relationship to the Griffins than the previous version of the story suggested. The version most people know is the one established early in the series. Brian was a stray. Peter found him washing car windshields at an intersection for spare change, the way some homeless people do, which is already extraordinary as a concept, a dog panhandling, but the show plays it completely straight. Peter was moved by Brian's situation, took pity on him, and offered him a home. Brian accepted, and the arrangement became permanent. This is confirmed in the first season episode, Brian, Portrait of a Dog, which leans into Brian's status as a dog and explores how the world treats him differently because of it. The Stray Taken In story is foundational. It explains the whole dynamic. Peter's loyalty to Brian makes sense if he sees Brian as someone he rescued, someone who owes his comfortable life to Peter's generosity. But then Season 7 produced an episode called The Man with Two Brians, and in it, Brian tries to win his family back after they start preferring a new dog named New Brian. To remind them of good times together, Brian shows the family home videos of himself as a small puppy, and the videos show him already in the Griffin house, as a puppy, living there. If Peter found Brian as an adult dog washing windshields, how do home videos of puppy Brian in the Griffin house exist? The show never addressed this. It moved on. The next episode arrived and nobody mentioned it, because in the world of Family Guy, continuity is a suggestion rather than a commitment. But the paradox is real. Either Brian was found as an adult, and there are no puppy videos that could possibly exist, or Brian was with the Griffins since he was young, in which case the entire origin story from Season 1 is wrong. It gets more complicated from there. The show has at various points tried to flesh out Brian's life before the Griffins, and each attempt adds new details that sit awkwardly against the existing record. We eventually learn that Brian was born in Austin, Texas, in a litter of 5 puppies. His father was a guard dog named Coco who died after being hit by a truck. His mother was named Biscuit, and she gave Brian away when he was very young so he could have a better life away from the puppy mill in Texas. From there, Brian was adopted by a family called the Hendersons. He went missing at some point, possibly while he was still very young. The Hendersons eventually stopped searching for him and left it up to fate. Brian became a stray, drifted to Rhode Island, and ended up at that intersection where Peter found him. That is a coherent backstory on its own terms, but it creates new problems when laid against everything else the show has told us. The home videos of puppy Brian in the Griffin house don't fit into this timeline at all. Season 18 added yet another detail. A friend named Shredder, who Brian left behind when he was adopted, and who has apparently been angry about it ever since. We also learn, separately, that Brian had a son, a human-looking child named Dylan, from a relationship he had before the show began, which adds an entirely new chapter to his pre-Griffin life that raises more questions than it answers. Brian's age is its own ongoing puzzle. In the episode Brian in Love, he states that he is 7 years old, and if he plays his cards right, has about 7 more years ahead of him. That would put his natural lifespan at around 14, which is reasonable for a dog. But later episodes establish that Brian is 10 years old, and the show's wiki notes that his age is usually treated differently depending on the joke. He also claims at one point to have voted for John McCain, which would require him to be at least 18 years old by human legal standards, though the show has never explained how a dog would be registered to vote or what documentation that would require. And then there is Brian's death and resurrection, which we will cover in its own section later, but which adds an entirely different dimension to who Brian is and what his existence means within the show. The fact that he can die, that the death was treated as permanent and real and emotionally significant, and then was reversed, that creates a before and an after in Brian's story that the show has never quite reckoned with. There is a version of Brian who was killed by a car in Season 12. There is a version of Brian who was not. Both versions are, somehow, the same Brian, and the show moves on as though the entire event was a dream. The contradiction in Brian's origin is not just a continuity error. It says something about how the show relates to its own characters. Brian is the character Seth MacFarlane has described as his favorite, the one whose voice is closest to MacFarlane's own. And yet even Brian doesn't get a stable past. Even Brian gets rewritten when the needs of a joke or a season require it. His history is as floating as the show's timeline, constantly being revised, never quite settling into a version you can hold on to. He is a dog who has been many dogs, a stray who was also a puppy in a loving home, a character who has been both alive and dead in the same continuity, who first arrived as an adult and also as a puppy, who is 7 and also 10 and also old enough to vote. In the show's universe, Brian is the most grounded character. In any other universe, he is the most paradoxical one. Section 4. The Man Who Created the Universe. In Season 9, Episode 16, Stewie Griffin discovers that he accidentally caused the Big Bang. Let that sit for a moment. The Big Bang, the origin point of the known universe. the primordial event from which all matter and energy and space and time emerged roughly 13.8 billion years ago, was caused, according to Family Guy, by a 1-year-old baby from Rhode Island who was trying to fix a disagreement about a witty comeback. This is the premise of The Big Bang Theory, and the way the show arrives at it is genuinely elaborate. It starts small. Stewie delivers a terrible comeback in a verbal sparring session with Brian, and it lands so badly that both Brian and Chris laugh at him. Stewie, unable to tolerate the humiliation, uses his time machine to go back and redo the moment. He succeeds, delivers a better line, comes back to the present feeling satisfied, and then he decides to keep going. He starts using the time machine to mess with Brian in small ways, traveling back to episodes that have already aired in the show's own history, changing small details, embarrassing Brian at moments he thought were safely in the past. Brian discovers what's happening, and the two of them end up fighting over the controls of the time machine in a particularly heated moment. The struggle becomes physical. Buttons are pressed, dials are turned, and then something goes wrong in a way that neither of them anticipated. They are ejected from space-time itself. Not into the past. Not into the future. Into the void that exists outside of the universe, a blank white space, where the laws of physics don't apply, where Stewie's return pad can't get them home, where there is nothing, because there is nothing, because the universe hasn't started yet. To get back, Stewie has to take a drastic measure. He overloads the return pad's reactor, creating an explosion powerful enough to push them back into the space-time continuum. The explosion works. They return. And then, days later, Stewie is sitting in his room going through the data, and he puts together what happened. The energy signature from his return pad's explosion matches exactly the cosmic background radiation, the faint afterglow of light and heat that permeates the entire universe and is considered one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the Big Bang. The signature is identical. The conclusion is inescapable. Stewie's overloaded return pad was the Big Bang. The explosion that created the universe was a 1-year-old baby from 1999 trying to get home from a place outside of space-time. And this is where the paradox becomes genuinely dizzying, because Stewie works through the logic of it in the episode and articulates what's actually happening. He explains to Brian that this is what's called a temporal predestination paradox, also sometimes called a causality loop. The universe existed before Stewie was born. The universe created the conditions for the Earth to form, for life to evolve, for human civilization to develop, for Peter Griffin to be born, for Lois Pewter-Schmidt to fall in love with him, for Stewie to be born, for Stewie to build a time machine, for Stewie to get into a fight with Brian over that time machine, for both of them to be ejected outside of space-time, and for Stewie to create an explosion that became the Big Bang that created the universe that eventually led to Stewie being born. There is no beginning to this loop. There is no end. The universe created Stewie so that Stewie could create the universe. The loop predates itself. It is a closed circle of causation stretching across 13.8 billion years of cosmic history. Brian, to his credit, immediately asks the question that anyone paying attention would ask. What does it mean that Stewie created the universe? Does that make him God? Stewie considers this and essentially says yes, in the specific sense that the explosion that originated everything came from him. He is the source. He is the first cause. The baby in the high chair who eats Cheerios and watches Sesame Street and builds world domination devices in his nursery is, technically, cosmically, the creator of all things. But the story keeps going, because villains in Family Guy don't tend to stay quiet when there are opportunities for chaos. Stewie's evil half-brother Bertram, who exists because Peter, in separate storylines, has been a sperm donor, and Bertram was one of the results, discovers that Stewie has a time machine. Bertram is the kind of character who, upon learning that his brother is a cosmic creator, immediately starts thinking about how to undo that. He travels back to the Italian Renaissance with the stolen return pad, finds Stewie's ancestor revealed to be Leonardo da Vinci himself, which explains a great deal about where Stewie's genius comes from, and kills him. This is where the paradox compounds. If Stewie's ancestor is killed, Stewie is never born. If Stewie is never born, he never builds a time machine. If he never builds a time machine, he never ends up outside of space-time. If he never ends up outside of space-time, he never creates the explosion. If he never creates the explosion, the Big Bang never happens. If the Big Bang never happens, the universe never exists. Bertram, in trying to erase Stewie, is simultaneously erasing all of reality, and he does it anyway, because Bertram is that kind of person. Stewie and Brian race back to the Renaissance to stop Bertram. They arrive, they fight. Stewie tries to reason with Bertram, telling him that erasing him from history will destroy the universe, all of it, not just Earth, not just the solar system, but everything that has ever existed or ever will exist. Bertram's response is essentially that he considers this an acceptable trade. If the cost of eliminating Stewie is the destruction of the cosmos, Bertram is willing to pay it. Bertram kills Leonardo da Vinci. Stewie kills Bertram. And then reality starts to unravel. What saves everything is one of the most absurd and logically satisfying solutions the show has ever produced. Stewie realizes that if the universe still exists, even after Da Vinci's death, there must be a way for him to still be born. He has to become his own ancestor. He has to inject his own genetic material into the timeline in a way that ensures his own lineage continues. He does this. The episode is deliberately vague about the precise mechanics, and wisely so, and then cryogenically freezes himself under the basement of the Da Vinci household, leaving a letter to be delivered to Brian in the present day by a Vatican priest, directing Brian to dig up the spot where he is buried. Brian digs. Stewie is unearthed. The universe is intact, and the closing piece of the puzzle falls into place. Stewie is not just descended from Leonardo da Vinci. Stewie is Leonardo da Vinci, in the sense that his genetic material became part of the lineage that eventually produced him. He is his own ancestor. The causality loop is complete. The Big Bang happened because Stewie would one day be born. Stewie would one day be born because the Big Bang happened. And buried somewhere under what is now central Italy is a cryopod containing a version of Stewie who waited 500 years for Brian to find him. Of all the paradoxes in Family Guy, this is the one that is most genuinely philosophically interesting. It is also, somehow, played almost entirely for laughs. The show manages to propose a complete cosmological origin theory built around a one-year-old child from a cartoon about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family, and make it feel not just plausible but inevitable. The universe needed Stewie. Stewie needed the universe to need him, and around it goes, forever, with no seam showing where the loop closes. Section 5. The Pilot That Changed History. Brian Griffin, in the fall of 2011, accidentally caused an alternate version of the American Civil War. This happened because he wanted a tennis ball. The setup to Back to the Pilot, which aired on the 13th of November 2011, right on the 10th anniversary of the original 9/11 attacks, is deceptively simple. Brian finds an old tennis ball and mentions, wistfully, that he buried another tennis ball somewhere in the yard back in 1999 and could never find it. Stewie, who has a working time machine and relatively few ethical barriers around using it, offers to take them both back to the pilot episode, the very first episode of Family Guy, which aired in January 1999, so Brian can observe where past Brian buried the tennis ball. They go. They arrive in 1999. The animation style shifts to reflect the original pilot's rougher, looser look, and Stewie spends a fair amount of time gleefully cataloging the production errors in the original episode: a television set that isn't plugged in, a character's eye positioned incorrectly, small inconsistencies in the background design. The show is doing something it does occasionally and does well, looking at its own past with a kind of affectionate, self-aware clarity. But Brian can't resist more than just tennis ball retrieval. He encounters his 1,999 self and, unable to help himself, tells past Brian about the September 11th attacks. He wants to give his past self the chance to prevent it, to save lives, to make the world different. When they return to the present, it is different. Brian stopped the attacks. He is a national hero. His face is on magazine covers. There are monuments to him. He recorded himself subduing the hijackers and has been dining out on it ever since. It seems for a moment like this might be a good outcome. And then the second layer arrives. Without the September 11th attacks, the political landscape of the 2000s developed differently. George W. Bush, unable to rally the country around the fear and grief that the attacks generated, lost the 2004 presidential election to John Kerry. Bush returned to Texas. Feeling humiliated and politically outmaneuvered, he took the state of Texas and declared a second Confederacy, launching what became a second American Civil War. When Brian and Stewie fast forward to see how things played out in 2016, they find a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Nuclear attacks on the eastern seaboard, 17 million dead. The United States fragmented and burning. Brian's well-intentioned act of mercy turned out to have worse downstream consequences than the original tragedy it prevented. The butterfly effect, applied to American history with maximum satirical force. So they go back to 1999, again, to stop Brian from telling his past self about the attacks. They succeed. They return to the present. And Brian, completely unreformed and apparently incapable of learning, has used the second visit to the past to tell his 1999 self something else. Specifically, that the Harry Potter series hasn't been written yet and that Brian could publish the books himself and take credit for them. They go back a third time. And this is where the episode's central paradox blooms into something spectacular. Every time Brian and Stewie go back to the pilot episode to fix what the previous version of themselves did, a new pair of Brians and Stewies is created, the versions from each corrected timeline, who still remember their own version of events, who still exist in the present they came from, and who have now traveled back to the same convergence point. By the third or fourth visit, there are multiple pairs of Brian and Stewie from multiple alternate timelines, all occupying the same moment in 1999 at the same time. Some of them are clearly from very different versions of events. There is a Brian whose throat has been cut. There is a Stewie who appears to have grown female anatomy at some point in his alternate timeline. There is a pair of Brian and Stewie who are somehow trapped inside barber poles, spinning slowly, unable to leave, and only able to scream warnings at the others. There is a pair dressed in banana costumes, a reference to the peanut butter jelly time gag from an earlier episode. A pair is accompanied by a version of Peter who has clearly also traveled back somehow. The scene becomes a crowded, chaotic argument between a dozen versions of two characters, each one representing a different branch of history that Brian's meddling created. Eventually, the Prime Stewie, the original one from the unaltered timeline, calls for order. He proposes a vote. Should they prevent the September 11th attacks or not? The vote goes around the room. Almost every version of Stewie votes no. Almost every version of Brian votes yes. Peter votes yes twice. The majority says no. The original timeline is restored, but the episode ends with a final small twist that the show doesn't quite acknowledge the full weight of. When Stewie forces the prime versions of Brian and Stewie to go back to the present, he does it by intercepting himself, by going back to just before their first arrival, and forcing past Stewie and past Brian to return without ever making the original trip. This means that the version of Stewie doing the intercepting is a version who made the original trip, who saw all the consequences, who participated in the multi-timeline summit in 1999. And when that corrected timeline is restored, that version of Stewie is erased. He ceases to have existed. The memories of everything he saw are simply gone. The paradox here is one that time travel stories return to constantly because it's so difficult to resolve. If you go back in time to prevent yourself from making a trip, how did you ever make the trip in the first place? Stewie could only know to stop himself because he made the original journey. But if he stops himself, the original journey never happened. The knowledge that allowed him to perform the correction was obtained in a version of events that the correction eliminates. The episode is clever enough to leave this hanging. Brian, nursing a bullet wound to the leg from a miscommunication between present Brian and a past version of himself, reflects that they're lucky the altered present didn't affect them. Stewie agrees. And then Peter arrives with 1,999 versions of his friends from the pilot, having brought them to the present by accident, which the show plays as a joke. The pilot episode, which started this particular adventure, is of course the show's first episode. And back to the pilot is the show visiting its own beginning and noticing, with clear eyes, how much has changed. The characters are different. The animation is different. The stories being told are different. The show looking at its own past is also the show grappling with the fact that it has been running long enough to have a substantial past to look at. In the alternate future where 9/11 never happened, Family Guy still exists, but it has become a lazily written CGI cartoon, its characters' dialogue so degraded that they can't even properly set up a cutaway gag. The show imagines a version of itself that declined further than it actually did and presents it as dystopia. There is something both funny and a little sad about that image. The tennis ball, by the way. Brian finds it. That's how the episode starts, and that's how it ends, too. A small domestic detail around which the show built an adventure that touched the September 11th attacks, the structure of American democracy, the multiverse, and the fundamental instability of causality. All of that for a tennis ball. Section 6. The Infinite Multiverse Next Door. On the 27th of September 2009, Family Guy changed the rules of its own universe by introducing a device that shouldn't be able to exist. Stewie's Multiverse Remote Control, a small handheld device that allows the user to jump between parallel universes, first appears in Road to the Multiverse, the premiere of Season 8, and it rewrites everything the show has been pretending to be up to that point. Before the remote, Family Guy was a grounded cartoon comedy, more or less. Dysfunctional, chaotic, willing to push into absurdity but still set in something that resembled a recognizable world. After the remote, the show has to accommodate the fact that the version of Quahog we watch every week is one of an infinite number of versions, all existing simultaneously, all slightly or dramatically different from each other. This is what Stewie explains to Brian in the opening minutes of the episode, while showing off the genetically engineered pig he's brought back from a parallel universe as a fair entry. The multiverse theory, Stewie says, states that there are an infinite number of universes coexisting on parallel dimensional planes. In each of these alternate universes, reality is different from our own, sometimes only slightly, sometimes quite radically. The remote can navigate between them. The universe Brian and Stewie live in is one of infinitely many. What follows is a tour of about 15 alternate versions of the show's setting, each one a different riff on what Quahog and the Griffins might look like under different historical or physical conditions. The first stop is a universe where Christianity never existed and therefore the dark ages of scientific repression never occurred, leaving humanity approximately 1,000 years more technologically advanced than the world Stewie and Brian come from. The Griffin family exists in this universe. Meg is inexplicably beautiful. Stewie informs Brian she's a 36D, and notes that even in this universe she's considered one of the ugly ones. Quagmire has apparently already cured AIDS with an over-the-counter medication called NyQuil Cold, Flu, and AIDS. From there, they visit a universe drawn in the style of the Flintstones, where everyone uses rocks as a suffix, and the Griffin house is made of prehistoric materials. Then a universe where Japan dominated the Pacific War and now controls the United States, where every character speaks Japanese and the architecture has been transformed. A universe where everyone simultaneously needs to use the bathroom. A universe where everyone has two heads, one happy, one sad, and both heads voice constant commentary on whatever is happening. A universe frozen in an ice age. A universe animated in the style of the Disney animated films of the 1930s through 1950s, where the Griffin family break into an elaborate song about pie, while Mort Goldman's arrival triggers something that can only be described as a Disney-style mob. A universe where everything is animated in the stop-motion style of Robot Chicken. A universe where Brian and Stewie appear in live action, actual footage of a real dog and a real baby, and then the one that Brian and Stewie spend the most time in. A universe where dogs are the dominant species and humans are their pets. In this world, the Griffin house exists, but is inhabited by dog versions of the family dog Peter, dog Lois, dog Meg and Chris and Stewie. Their pet is a human named Brian. The reversal is complete. The character who, in the main universe, occupies the peculiar middle space between human and animal walking upright, talking, driving a car, but still a dog, still capable of being treated as property, gets to see what his world would look like with the hierarchy inverted. Brian likes it. Of course he likes it. He wants to stay. The question the episode raises, and never quite answers, is what the existence of these infinite universes means for the show we've been watching. If there is a universe where Christianity never existed, there is presumably a universe where Family Guy never premiered. A universe where Seth MacFarlane never pitched his pilot to Fox. A universe where the Griffin family is a completely ordinary Rhode Island family with no talking dog and no evil genius baby. Just a father and mother and 3 kids living a quiet life on Spooner Street. There is also presumably a universe where Family Guy ran for 3 seasons, got canceled, and stayed canceled the path the show almost took in 2002. In that universe, there is no revival, no season 4, no multiverse episode, no discussion of this kind at all. The Griffins of that universe exist in a show that simply ended, and they have no knowledge that in a parallel dimension, they kept going for decades more. The multiverse remote also raises immediate practical paradoxes. Stewie has had this device for some time before the episode. He got the pig from another universe using it. He's been traveling. What has he brought back? What has he left behind? Every trip into a parallel universe is, by the logic the episode establishes, a disruption to that universe's history. Stewie and Brian being present in the dog universe causes events to unfold differently than they otherwise would have. Human Brian, from the dog universe, makes the decision to cross over into the main universe and is struck by a car seconds after arriving a different death. In a different universe, of a version of Brian who never would have made that trip if Stewie and Brian from the main universe hadn't shown up. This is the butterfly effect operating across dimensional boundaries, not just across time. Every visit to a parallel universe changes that universe. Every version of Quahog that Stewie and Brian pass through is slightly altered by their passage. And if that logic holds, then the main universe, the one where the show is set, has presumably been visited by versions of Stewie and Brian from parallel timelines that we never see. There might be another pair of them here right now, quietly observing, trying not to disturb anything. The episode was received extremely well. It drew 10.17 million viewers during its original airing, which was one of the best numbers the show had seen in years. Its Emmy win for storyboarding was deserved, and it established, permanently, a piece of the show's metaphysics that would be referenced and built upon in subsequent seasons. There is no single Family Guy universe. There are infinite of them, and the one we watch is just the one the remote happens to be pointing at. That makes everything slightly more dreamlike and slightly more strange. The show you have been watching is one of infinite shows. The Griffins you know are one of infinite Griffins. Every decision that ever went differently somewhere produces a new branch. Every timeline where Brian stopped 9/11, or where Stewie was never born, or where the Dark Ages never happened, all of those are real, all happening simultaneously, all containing versions of these characters living slightly or dramatically different lives. The remote exists. The multiverse exists. And somewhere in an alternate universe, there is a version of this video that went completely differently. Section 7. The time that ran backwards. The thing about time in the Family Guy universe is that it turns out to be much more fragile than anyone expected. In Yug Elamov, which is Family Guy backwards, a detail the show makes sure you notice Brian breaks causality itself by trying to reset an odometer. This is a very Brian thing to do. He has been sneaking into Stewie's room and using the time machine to take women he meets at bars on romantic trips through history. The trips are working. He takes one woman to witness Abraham Lincoln's assassination on what she mistakenly believes is a Valentine's Day date, and she seems charmed rather than disturbed by this. Brian is pleased with himself. He has a useful tool. It belongs to someone else, and he is using it without permission in ways its owner never intended. The problem arrives when one of his dates notices a gauge on the time machine labeled years traveled and points out that Stewie will surely notice the reading when he checks it. Brian panics and does what Brian does when he panics. He makes the situation dramatically worse. He tries to roll the gauge backward to reset it, the way someone might try to roll back the odometer on a car to hide how many miles they've driven. The gauge is not designed to go backward. It was never meant to go backward. Attempting to force it backward causes the machine to overload, explode, and somehow reverse the fundamental direction in which time flows. Time starts running in reverse. Not just for Stewie and Brian, who are inside the machine at the moment of the explosion and are therefore shielded from the initial effects, but for everything else. For Quahog, for the world, for the universe, the reversal is gradual at first. Brian notices Mort Goldman placing a coin on the sidewalk and walking away from it, which is so counter to Mort's nature that it takes Brian a moment to understand what he's seeing. Then he sees cars driving backward through the street, people walking backward. A fight between Peter and the giant chicken, a recurring bit in the show where Peter and an enormous chicken have elaborate, destructive brawls across the city playing in reverse. The two of them methodically unfighting, reassembling what they destroyed, the city putting itself back together. Cleveland, who has been living in another state since leaving Quahog for his own spin-off show, is suddenly back across the street. The departure that ended one chapter of the show's history has been undone by the reversal. Seasons of development have been rolled back just from the time machine spending a few minutes broken. The reversal accelerates. This is where it gets genuinely unsettling. Time doesn't just run backwards at the same speed. It ran forward, it starts to speed up in reverse. The effect of this, as the show depicts it, is that events from further and further back in the show's history begin to manifest. Stewie starts losing teeth. His walking becomes unsteady. He regresses through developmental stages he had already passed through, becoming less capable, younger, smaller, as the timeline races backward toward his birth. Stewie understands exactly what this means and tells Brian with complete clarity. If the time machine isn't fixed before they reach the date of Stewie's birth, he will be unborn. He will cease to have existed. Everything he has ever done, every adventure, every device, every scheme, every moment with Brian will be unmade by the simple mechanical fact of time, reversing past the point when he entered the world. Brian attempts to repair the time machine while Stewie is still able to help him. They work backward through the history of the show, a sequence that functions as a kind of greatest hits montage. Scenes from earlier episodes appearing in reverse, jokes playing backwards, the signature moments of the series unwinding like thread from a spool. The Ipecac challenge from an earlier episode plays in reverse, which the show depicts in a way that is as disgusting as it sounds. A diaper change occurs in reverse. The chicken fight rebuilds the town. Stewie loses the ability to walk. He is taken to the hospital. He is placed back in Lois's arms, smaller than he was, quieter, less himself. Brian, still in Stewie's room with the broken machine, makes the connection that the solution might be the inverse of the problem. If rolling the gauge backward caused the reversal, rolling it forward again should restore normal time. He does this. The machine explodes again. He wakes up. The timeline has restored. He races to the hospital, and he arrives just in time to be present at Stewie's birth, which means Brian was in that hospital room on the day Stewie entered the world. The episode ends with Brian inadvertently giving Stewie his name, which is the kind of small, elegant loop the show does better than almost anything else. The paradox of Hugh Illimov is primarily temporal. It is about what happens when time breaks, but it opens into a philosophical question that the episode doesn't linger on, but that is worth sitting with. If time could be reversed, and if it could be accelerated in its reversal, then everything that has happened in the show is more fragile than it appears. The adventures, the milestones, the deaths and resurrections and births, all of it is contingent. All of it depends on time continuing to flow in the direction it's supposed to flow. Brian's carelessness nearly unmade everything. There is also the matter of what the restoration means. When Brian fixes the machine and time returns to its normal direction, the reversed events don't simply unhappen, they reset. The version of Stewie who was nearly unborn is the same Stewie who has all his memories intact when he's reborn at the end of the episode. The reversal happened, and then the reversal of the reversal happened, and the result is that Stewie exists twice at the same moment. There is the Stewie who was nearly unmade, and there is the Stewie being born fresh, and they converge into the same person who then rides home with Peter and Lois. What remains, after all of that, is the odd and specific image of Brian standing in that hospital room, present at the beginning. The one who saved it. A dog who almost accidentally destroyed the timeline, now witnessing the entry of the person whose existence holds that timeline together. The time machine is in Stewie's room. It is always in Stewie's room. And as long as it's there, the possibility of all of this happening again is never more than one careless moment away. Section 8. Peter Griffin's Impossible Past. Peter Griffin has been many things, depending on the episode. He is a factory worker. He is a brewery employee. He is a fisherman. He is a Renaissance fair knight. He has been a soldier, a priest student, a pirate radio operator, and briefly, a television news personality. He has a past in Mexico, a past in Ireland, a past in 17th century England, and a past that extends all the way back to the Big Bang. Given that the Griffin family history episode begins with the formation of the universe and tracks the family line from there, Peter Griffin's personal history is one of the most elaborately contradictory collections of backstory in animated television. The show has told his origin story so many times, in so many ways, with so many incompatible details, that reconstructing a coherent biography for him is essentially impossible. Not challenging impossible. The pieces don't fit together because they were never designed to fit together. Each was written for a joke in a specific episode, with whatever details that joke required, and then placed alongside every other joke-driven detail without checking whether any of them were consistent. The most fundamental contradiction involves Peter's birth. In one episode, Peter is born in the United States, in the standard way. In the episode Padre de Familia, however, it is revealed that Peter was born in Mexico, where his mother had traveled and attempted unsuccessfully to have an abortion. This makes Peter technically Mexican-born, which creates all sorts of implications for his citizenship, his identity, and his relationship to the American patriotism he typically performs with such enthusiasm. The episode plays this for satirical effect, but it is canonically established. Peter was born in Mexico. His biological father is another layer of contradiction. Peter was raised by Francis Griffin, a stern Irish-American man who was a frequent presence in early seasons. It was known that Francis was not particularly warm or encouraging, and their relationship was tense. But in the episode Peter's Two Dads, the full story emerged. Francis is not Peter's biological father at all. Peter's biological father is an Irishman named Mickey McFinnigan, with whom Peter's mother had an affair. Peter discovers this, travels to Ireland to find Mickey, and the two of them connect in ways that complicate Peter's already complicated sense of identity. This means Peter is simultaneously the son of Francis Griffin by upbringing and legal record, and Mickey McFinnigan by biology, born in Mexico to an Irish-American mother and raised in the United States. His birth certificate, shown in the episode Quagmire's Mom, lists his name as Justin Peter Griffin, not Peter Loewenbroy Griffin, which is the name the show has used at other points. The middle name Lowenbro appearing in the episode Peter Caviar Eater, when Peter is trying to impress Lois's wealthy family. Whether Justin is his legal name and Peter is a nickname, or whether one of these is a continuity error, is never clarified. Then there is the matter of Peter's ancestry, which the show has explored in episodes including the Griffin family history, the untitled Griffin family history, and Peter's progress. Peter has a past life as Griffin Peterson, an English gentleman from the 17th century who was exiled to the New World and eventually founded Quahog, the very city where the show is set. This means that Peter is somehow the ancestor of himself. He founded the town his descendant would be born in, marry in, raise children in, and spend his entire life in. The founding story of Quahog involves a griffin, and the current griffin is living on top of that history, usually without any awareness of it. Peter also has African-American ancestry through a character named Nate Griffin, a slave in 19th century America who fell in love with the owner's daughter, a woman who was herself an ancestor of Lois Pewterschmidt. This means that Peter and Lois, who married each other, are distantly related. Their ancestry converges in the 19th century through Nate Griffin and the plantation owner's family. The show presents this in the family history episode and then never returns to it. But it is sitting there in the canon, a biological reality that the show acknowledged once and quietly set aside. Peter's age is its own ongoing contradiction. He appears to be in his mid-40s. 42 is the number most commonly cited, and the show's own wiki describes him this way. But a future set scene in the episode Peter's Lost Youth has Peter claiming to be 58. His most recently named age in the regular timeline was 45, in the episode The Jersey Boar. By real-world arithmetic, if the show started in 1999 and Peter was 42 then, he should be 69 now. The show has never attempted to reconcile any of these numbers. There is also the episode Petarded from Season 4, in which Peter discovers that he scored low enough on an IQ test to be clinically diagnosed as intellectually disabled. He briefly enjoys the legal protections this affords him before the episode resolves, and the diagnosis is never mentioned again. Later episodes have Peter demonstrating various levels of intelligence that are impossible to reconcile with the diagnosis. Sometimes he is functionally incapable of basic reasoning. Sometimes he demonstrates a kind of low cunning that is surprisingly effective. Sometimes he makes decisions that suggest awareness and intentionality. The diagnosis exists in one episode and nowhere else. What Peter Griffin's impossible past reveals is that he is, fundamentally, a vessel for whatever the show needs him to be in a given moment. He is Irish when the show needs an Irish joke. He is a founding father when the show needs a historical episode. He is disabled when the show needs to explore the legal definition of intellectual disability. He is the son of Mickey McFinnigan when the show needs a father-son reconciliation story set in Ireland. Every episode that expands his backstory is adding paint to a canvas that the show never intended to form a coherent portrait. But there is something interesting underneath all the contradiction. Peter Griffin, despite the impossibility of his origins, is one of the most consistent characters the show has produced in terms of presence and personality. You always know when you're watching Peter. His voice, his physical comedy, his relationship to the world, these things remain constant even when everything around them shifts. The details of his past are a chaos, but the essential Peterness of him is stable. Maybe that is the answer to the paradox, in the end. The details don't matter. The history doesn't matter. What matters is that Peter Griffin is always, immediately, himself. And no amount of contradictory biography can change that. Section 9. The Death That Wasn't. On the 24th of November 2013, Brian Griffin was hit by a car and killed. The episode was called Life of Brian, a title lifted from the Monty Python film, which was itself about a man constantly mistaken for a savior, which is perhaps more appropriate to Brian's situation than the show intended. The death was treated with complete seriousness. The Griffin family gathered around the body. They mourned. Stewie, who had recently destroyed his time machine and therefore had no way to go back and undo what happened, was devastated in a way the show hadn't shown him being devastated in years. A new dog named Vinny was eventually introduced as a replacement, voiced by Tony Sirico, and the family began to move on. It made national news. Brian Griffin's death trended on social media for days. People who had watched the show for years and had complicated feelings about how Brian had changed since the early seasons found themselves genuinely grieving a cartoon dog. People who had never watched the show heard about it and reacted. The death was discussed in newspapers and entertainment magazines as a genuine cultural event, the permanent removal of a major character from a long-running animated series. 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode Christmas Guy, Brian was back. The mechanism was elegant, in a show mythology way. Stewie, in the episode Life of Brian, had made one final trip in the time machine before destroying it a trip to the future, to a point in December of that same year. In Christmas Guy, Stewie is at the mall and notices another version of himself, a version from that prior future trip, walking through the crowd. He approaches this past version of himself and, without fully explaining the situation, borrows the return pad, the device that brings time travelers back to the present from whatever point in time they visited. Stewie uses the borrowed return pad to travel back to the moment just before Brian was hit by the car, physically tackle Brian out of the vehicle's path, and save his life. The return pad that enabled Brian's rescue was borrowed from a past version of Stewie who had it because he had traveled to the future for an unrelated purpose before the time machine was destroyed. That future Stewie no longer needed the return pad because he used it to return to his own present, which is how it ended up with the mall version of Stewie, which is how the present Stewie was able to borrow it, which is how Brian was saved. This is a clean causality loop of the sort the show has used before, but what makes it paradoxical is the question of what happened to the timeline between Brian's death and Brian's rescue. For the 2 episodes that elapsed between Life of Brian and Christmas Guy, there exists a version of the show's history in which Brian Griffin was dead. The Griffin family grieved him. Vinny was adopted. Life reorganized itself around his absence. And then Stewie intervened and all of that was erased. The version of the Griffin family who experienced Brian's death no longer exists. Their grief was real. It was genuine emotion, shown on screen, treated with more weight than the show typically gives to emotional beats. But that reality was replaced, overwritten. Those 2 episodes of loss were undone not by the characters processing and healing from them, but by time travel removing the loss from having ever happened. What does that mean for the Stewie who did the rescuing? He lived through Brian's death. He felt the grief. He spent however long the time between those 2 episodes represents being without his best friend, experiencing the specific, hollow quality of an absence that cannot be filled. And then he went back and removed that experience from the timeline, not from his own memory, because he lived through it, but from the official record of what happened. His grief was real. His loss was real. And he chose to undo both of them for Brian, because the love was stronger than the cost. That is, genuinely, one of the more quietly moving things the show has done. Under all the paradox, there is a story about a baby who lost his best friend, who couldn't fix it immediately, who sat with the loss long enough to feel it, and then who, when the opportunity came, didn't hesitate. But the paradox remains. There is a version of the show's history that is now inaccessible. A Vinny who was adopted and then unadopted. A family that mourned and then had that mourning taken away. A Brian who died and then didn't. The 2-episode gap between Life of Brian and Christmas Guy represents a pocket of reality that was sealed off from the main timeline, but that still, somehow, existed. It was real. Vinny was real. The grief was real. And then it wasn't. The show has never addressed what Stewie remembers about those 2 episodes. Does he carry the memory of Brian's death with him? Does he see Brian across the breakfast table and feel the specific relief of someone who went back and changed something terrible? Is there a version of Stewie who wakes up some mornings and for just a moment, in the half-second between sleep and waking, remembers a world where Brian was gone? The show would prefer you not ask these questions. It prefers you to experience the reunion in Christmas Guy as a happy ending, which it is, and leave the paradox where it landed. But the questions are there, and they don't go away just because the show moved on. Brian is alive. He was also dead. Both things are true in different strata of the timeline, and the strata exist in the same show. Section 10. The reset button and what it means. Here is a meta-paradox that sits underneath all the others. Family Guy is a show that is aware of its own continuity failures, has made jokes about them, has built entire episodes around them, and yet continues to generate more of them. The show knows what it is. It just keeps doing it anyway. Back to the Pilot has Stewie and Brian visiting the first episode of the show and cataloging the errors they find there. That is the show pointing a finger at its own inconsistencies and laughing. The episode Yug Ilimov is titled Backwards, which is a joke about time reversal, but it also jokes about the show's own style. At one point, a cutaway gag plays in reverse, which Stewie notes with alarm, and then another cutaway plays normally, which he also notes with alarm. The show's signature comedy technique is being subjected to self-examination. The episode Stewie Kills Lois and its sequel Lois Kills Stewie from Season 6 are 2 of the most dramatically compelling things the show ever produced. Stewie finally accomplishes what he spent the first 3 seasons threatening: he kills Lois. She comes back. He takes over the world. He becomes the dictator he always described wanting to be. Peter rallies resistance. The stakes are enormous. The emotional investment is real. And then the twist arrives. None of it happened. All of it was a simulation running on Stewie's computer. The events were real within the simulation, but the real world reset at the end. Lois survived. Stewie's dictatorship was just a model. Everything went back to exactly where it was. This is the show engaging in what it would spend the next decade and a half doing on a smaller scale, episode by episode, generating consequences that it then withdraws, raising stakes that it then lowers, making promises that it doesn't keep. The simulation twist in that 2-parter is explicit about the mechanism. It's a simulation. Of course it resets, but the same logic operates everywhere. Peter learns a lesson and forgets it by next week. Meg stands up for herself and then takes it back. Brian dies and then doesn't. Stewie almost becomes a different kind of character and then is restored to his current self. The reset button in Family Guy isn't a bug. It is the architecture. What this creates is a show that exists in a permanent paradox of its own making. Every significant thing that happens is simultaneously real and provisional. Real enough that you can invest in it while it's happening. Provisional enough that the show can walk it back when the story needs to go a different direction. The characters have full, complicated histories. Things happen to them. Things they did, things they survived, and none of it accumulates in a way that changes who they fundamentally are. Peter Griffin has learned that he is mentally disabled, Irish, Mexican-born, a descendant of a slave, the reincarnation of Quahog's founder, and the son of a man he spent decades thinking wasn't his father. None of these revelations have changed Peter. He is the same Peter after all of them that he was before any of them. Brian has been a best-selling author, a political activist, a father, a dead dog, and an alive dog who remembers being a dead dog. He is still Essentially, the character you meet in the pilot. Stewie has created the universe, visited dozens of alternate realities, reversed time, traveled to the Renaissance, and been his own ancestor. He is still in a high chair. This is what makes Family Guy's paradoxes different from the paradoxes in, say, a science fiction story that is deliberately exploring what happens when time travel is possible. Family Guy's paradoxes are not there to be solved. They are not pointing toward a conclusion. They are the natural byproduct of a show that treats storytelling as a series of independent moments rather than a continuous narrative, and that therefore contains everything and forgets everything in equal measure. The question the show's critics have always asked, why don't the characters grow? Why don't consequences stick? Has an answer embedded in the structure of the paradox. Consequences don't stick because sticking would require the show to become something different from what it is. It would require it to track its own history with a fidelity it has never attempted. Every time a consequence stuck, every time a relationship changed, every time a character genuinely evolved, the show eventually found a way to walk it back. Because the version of the show where things stack and accumulate is a different show. A show that would look more like a drama. A show that would have to care about all the contradictions it has created. The show that exists is the show that jokes about its own contradictions and then generates more of them. There is a moment in Back to the Pilot where future Stewie and future Brian are watching a version of Family Guy set in the alternate timeline where 9/11 was prevented. The show within the show is a poorly animated CGI cartoon where characters can't even properly set up cutaway gags. The scene is the show imagining a worse version of itself and presenting it as a dystopia, which is funny, but also a kind of honesty. The show knows that a fully functioning version of its own comedy requires a specific set of conditions. It knows what it needs in order to work. It also knows, in that moment, that it has been running long enough to have outlasted some of those conditions. The characters have changed. The writing has changed. The show has changed. And rather than resolve that by becoming the thing it used to be, it makes a joke about it and then moves on. Every paradox in Family Guy is, at some level, about this. The floating timeline is a paradox because the show won't commit to time passing. Brian's contradictory origin is a paradox because the show won't commit to a single version of his past. Stewie's age is a paradox because the show won't commit to him growing up. The deaths and resurrections are paradoxes because the show won't commit to permanent consequences. The meta-paradox is this: a show that knows all of this, that has made these contradictions into the subject of entire episodes, that has explicitly acknowledged that it doesn't track its own continuity. That show is simultaneously the most and least trustworthy narrator of its own history. You cannot believe what it tells you about its past because the past changes. You cannot believe what it tells you about its future because the future is provisional. You can only believe what it shows you in the present moment you are watching, and then accept that the moment after that might contradict everything you just saw. This is actually very close to how dreams work. You are in a house, and the house is exactly right. And then you turn a corner and the house is wrong in a way it was never supposed to be. And then you are somewhere else entirely, and none of it is inconsistent from the inside. Because from the inside there is only now. The past of a dream is unknowable. The future of a dream hasn't happened yet. All that exists is the scene you are currently in, with exactly the logic it needs for that scene to make sense. Family Guy, when it is working, creates something like that experience. The show at its best pulls you into a present that is completely coherent. The joke lands, the character is fully realized, the moment has weight, and the fact that the moment before contradicted this one is simply not something you are thinking about while you are here. The paradoxes are the price of admission. The reset button is what allows the show to keep running. The floating timeline is what makes Stewie eternal. And Stewie is eternal. He is 1 year old and he has been 1 year old forever, and he will be 1 year old for as long as the show exists. He is in his crib right now, in a house on Spooner Street in a fictional Rhode Island city, surrounded by the same family he has always had, in a neighborhood that has not changed in 25 years. His time machine is in the corner. The return pad is charged. Brian is asleep downstairs. Outside the window, it is whatever season the show needs it to be. The neighborhood is quiet. The sky is whatever color it needs to be. And in that eternal present, in that impossible house on that impossible street, the paradoxes are all asleep until the next episode, when they will wake up again and begin. Section 11. The many deaths of Quahog. There is another layer of paradox in Family Guy that doesn't get discussed as much as the time travel or the multiverse, but which is just as interesting when you start looking for it. The town of Quahog itself has been destroyed, partially destroyed, or fundamentally altered so many times that its continued existence is a minor miracle of narrative will. Quahog has been hit by natural disasters. It has been invaded. It has been the site of nuclear threats, alien encounters, disease outbreaks, and at least one full-scale medieval siege. In alternate timelines, as seen in Back to the Pilot, it has been vaporized by nuclear attack. In Road to the Multiverse, there is a version of it frozen solid in an ice age, and another version that is a post-World War III wasteland. In the main timeline, a satellite crashed into it in one episode. The town has flooded, it has burned, and every single time, by the next episode, it is fine. The crater is gone, the satellite has been removed, the flood has receded, the fire has been put out. Quahog resets as completely as its residents do, the neighborhood absorbing catastrophe with the same blithe resilience that Peter absorbs a broken leg. This is, technically, physically impossible. A town that has experienced even a fraction of what Quahog has experienced would be unlivable. The infrastructure alone, water, electricity, road surfaces, would have been destroyed and repaired so many times that the economic cost would have been staggering. The insurance situation in Quahog must be extraordinary. The property values on Spooner Street, given that the street has been in the path of multiple disasters, should have collapsed long ago. No rational person would continue to live in a neighborhood that has been damaged this severely this many times. But the residents of Quahog are not rational people. They are cartoon characters in a floating timeline, and the town they live in floats with them, resetting as needed, always ready for the next episode's catastrophe. What makes this interesting as a paradox rather than just a production convenience is the episode Back to the Pilot, where the alternate timeline shows a version of America that has been permanently changed by one event. 9/11 being prevented while in the main timeline. Events far more destructive than 9/11 in terms of local impact have had no lasting effect on the community. The show is selective about which consequences it lets stick. National political history matters, apparently, and will generate permanent alternate timelines. But a nuclear satellite crashing into your town center is just a Tuesday. Mayor Adam West, a recurring character voiced by the late Adam West, who played himself as the eccentric mayor of Quahog for 17 seasons, presided over the town through all of this. His death in season 15 was handled differently from other Quahog events. It was treated as permanent, a real goodbye to a real person who had provided the character's voice. The show retired Mayor West rather than resetting him, because you cannot reset a real human being's absence. His successor, Wild Wild West, voiced by Sam Elliott, no relation took over the mayoral role. The town, in other words, can absorb the impossible without consequence, but the death of the person who gave voice to its most eccentric official required something genuine. The paradox of Quahog is also the paradox of the show itself. Cartoon logic applies to everything except the things that are really real. The houses rebuild, the roads repave, the mayor's office is occupied by someone new, and somewhere in the history of the town, beneath all the resets and repairs, there is the body of Griffin Peterson, the 17th century English gentleman, who founded the whole place after being exiled from England, presumably still buried under something on Spooner Street. His descendant lives above him, drives over him on the way to the brewery, has no idea he's there. The founder of the town and the person who unwittingly continues his line are separated by 3 centuries and about 12 feet of Rhode Island topsoil. That is the oldest paradox in Quahog. Not time travel, not alternate universes, not a baby who created the Big Bang, just a man who lived a long time ago, who built a town, whose blood runs in the family that now occupies the town he built, and who is as forgotten as every other piece of the show's history that accumulates and then dissolves. Quahog will survive. It always does, and it will never quite remember what it survived. Section 12. The show that watches itself. Somewhere between all the time machines and the alternate universes and the impossible ages and the impossible origins, there is a simpler and stranger paradox running through Family Guy that only becomes visible if you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. The show has become, in its later seasons, increasingly self-aware. Characters break the fourth wall. Peter talks directly to the audience. Episodes reference the show's own declining ratings. The writers make jokes about the writers. A character in one episode remarks that whatever they're doing probably isn't funny, which is a joke, but it's also a kind of honesty. The show acknowledges explicitly that it knows what it looks like from the outside. In Back to the Pilot, the alternate future version of Family Guy is a lazy CGI show where the cutaway gags don't work. The characters in that future version of the show are clearly worse off, flatter, less interesting, funnier, but in a cheaper way. The episode is presenting a dystopian version of the show as a warning, or maybe as a joke about warnings. It's hard to be sure which. In Cutaway Land, Peter and Lois discover they can enter the world of the show's cutaway gags, the random, disconnected vignettes that are the show's most famous stylistic device. They travel between them, experiencing gags from inside. The episode uses recycled cutaways from previous seasons, which is either meta-clever or just efficient depending on how generous you're feeling. The show knows it uses cutaways. The show knows that audiences have noticed how many cutaways there are. The show makes jokes about this while continuing to use cutaways at the same rate it always has. This is the meta-paradox. Knowing something and acknowledging it out loud doesn't change it. The show can be aware of its own patterns without breaking them. Self-awareness and self-correction are different things. Brian, in later seasons, becomes a mouthpiece for political views that are clearly the writer's own. The show knows this is happening. Quagmire's famous speech in Jerome is the New Black calls Brian out for exactly this, and the audience is clearly meant to agree with Quagmire. The show criticizes Brian's political soapboxing through a character in the show, and then Brian continues to soapbox in every subsequent episode, because the critique changed nothing. This is a different kind of paradox from the time travel ones, but it might be the most interesting one. It is the paradox of a show that has become sophisticated enough to observe itself, but not sophisticated enough to change based on what it observes. The meta-awareness is real. The self-knowledge is genuine, and yet it produces no different outcome than ignorance would have. Stewie and Brian in Back to the Pilot vote on whether to change history. The majority says no. Leave things as they are. The original timeline, with all its flaws and contradictions and accumulated damage, is still the one they choose to live in. Not because it's perfect, not because there isn't a better version available, but because the version they know, the version they have always been part of, is the version that made them who they are. There is something in that choice that feels true to what the show is, underneath everything. Family Guy is full of paradoxes, full of contradictions, full of things that don't add up and can't be reconciled. And yet there it is, every week, choosing to be exactly itself rather than the cleaned-up, consistent, dramatically coherent thing it could theoretically have become. The characters don't age. The timeline floats. The universe was created by a baby. The dog died and didn't. The town rebuilds. The pilot episode contains errors. The cutaway gags go on too long. The show knows all of this, and every week, from the Griffin House on Spooner Street in the fictional town of Quahog in the state of Rhode Island, the light is on. The family is home. Peter is doing something inadvisable. Lois is patient and then not. Meg is trying. Chris is trying in a different way. Stewie is in his crib, building something the rest of the house doesn't know about, and Brian is downstairs with a martini, reading or pretending to read, keeping his own counsel. The time machine is upstairs. The multiverse is one remote click away. History is always available for revision, and none of it changes what this is. A family, in a house, in a neighborhood that never changes, going through the same ordinary chaos they have always gone through. The paradoxes don't resolve, they accumulate. They layer over each other like the sediment that builds a riverbed, each one distinct, each one the product of a specific episode in a specific season written by specific people for a specific joke, but all of them together forming something that is more than the sum of its contradictions. A show with the impossible permanence of a neighborhood that has been there forever and will be there forever, even though it couldn't possibly be. The light is on. They're home. And somewhere in a room upstairs, a 1-year-old baby who created the universe is wide awake, making plans. If you made it all the way here, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Hit that subscribe button, it genuinely makes a difference, and it means the next deep dive gets made sooner. Drop a like if you fell asleep to this one at any point, and leave a comment telling me which paradox messed with your head the most. Until next time, sleep well. Section 11. Peter Griffin's impossible relationship with death. Peter Griffin has died many times. Not in the way Stewie died wrapped in a narrative about time travel and emotional consequence, but in the casual, almost throwaway way that the show has always treated serious things when it doesn't want them to be serious. Peter has been shot, stabbed, crushed, burned, drowned, suffocated, and subjected to forms of physical damage that would be instantly fatal to any biological organism. He regularly survives impacts that would kill an elephant. He has had fingers blown off by firecrackers and regrown them between scenes. He has been crushed under enormous weights and stood up, dusted himself off, and continued the conversation. The show treats Peter's body as a cartoon body, invulnerable in the ways convenience requires, vulnerable in the ways comedy demands. This is standard animated comedy logic, and Family Guy employs it without apology. But the paradox deepens when you consider that the show has also established, across multiple episodes, a specific and internally consistent theology about what happens when people die in this universe. Death is a character on the show, an actual character. He is portrayed as a Grim Reaper type, a tall hooded figure with a scythe, but the show humanizes him significantly. He watches television, he has a wife and family, he has personal problems. He appeared in the Season 2 episode Death is a Bitch, in which Peter accidentally signed a form declaring himself legally dead, and Death came to collect him, only to twist his ankle on the Griffin's porch. Peter then agreed to collect souls on Death's behalf while Death recovered, which is a premise so specific and yet so perfectly Family Guy that it requires no elaboration. The point is that Death is real in this universe. He has a specific job, he collects specific souls, and Peter has been in close proximity to him on multiple occasions without being permanently collected. In Meet the Quagmires, Peter asks Death to send him back to the 1980s so he can relive part of his past, and Death agrees as a personal favor. The show thus establishes that death is not just a force of nature, but a negotiable entity, someone whose decisions about who lives and dies can be influenced by personal relationships and specific appeals. This makes Peter's many survivals paradoxical in a specific way. If death is real, and if death is aware of Peter's situation, they have a relationship. After all, then why does Peter keep surviving things that should have collected him? Is Death simply not paying attention to Spooner Street because he's been there too many times and finds it exhausting? Has Peter entered some kind of informal arrangement where Death has agreed to look the other way? Or is it that, in this universe, cartoon invulnerability is the default state, and Death only shows up for events that the narrative has decided are actually fatal? This would mean that death, in Family Guy, is not a physical fact but a narrative decision. Characters die when the story says they die, survive when the story says they survive, and the biology of it is irrelevant. That would explain everything. It would explain Peter's impossible resilience. It would explain why certain characters have died permanently. Diane Simmons, killed in And Then There Were Fewer, who has never come back, while others have died and been immediately revived. Death doesn't work on physics in this universe. It works on plot. If that's true, then the paradox of Peter's survivals is not a paradox at all. It's just the show making its priorities clear. Characters survive when their death would cost too much to the ongoing story. Characters die when their death serves the narrative. And even then, as Brian demonstrated, the show reserves the right to change its mind. The character of Death, walking through this logic, becomes something almost poignant. He is a being of enormous cosmic responsibility who, in the Family Guy universe, has to deal with the fact that his domain is subject to revision. He shows up for an appointment and the appointment is canceled. He plans a collection and the collection is postponed. He has a list and items keep getting removed from it and then added back. Peter's impossible relationship with death is everyone's impossible relationship with death in this universe. The rules apply to everyone except when they don't. The consequences are permanent except when they aren't. And Death, walking his long route through Quahog, has learned to hold his schedule loosely because someone is always going to be unavailable when he arrives. There is also the episode where Peter physically encounters Death on a golf course and the two of them play around together with Peter's life as the stakes. Death agrees to these terms. He negotiates. He plays golf with a middle-aged man from Rhode Island for a soul he was supposed to collect without any of this negotiation. This is not standard Grim Reaper behavior. The death of this universe has been domesticated. He has been made reasonable, approachable, someone you can bargain with over 18 holes. The consequence is that the show's universe does not have a reliable mechanism for permanent loss. Things end when the narrative needs them to end and not before, which is simultaneously its greatest creative freedom and its most significant structural limitation. Peter dies and doesn't die. He suffers and recovers. He loses and regains. And death, carrying his scythe, moves on to someone else's address and makes a note to come back to Spooner Street later, when it's actually convenient, which might be never. Section 12. The Chicken Who Keeps Coming Back. There is no character in Family Guy whose existence raises more questions about the nature of time and consequence than Ernie the Giant Chicken. Ernie first appeared in the Season 2 episode, Da Boom, when he gave Peter an expired coupon for a free chicken sandwich, and Peter refused to let the slight go. What followed was an elaborate, prolonged physical fight between Peter and the enormous anthropomorphic chicken, in which the two of them destroyed significant portions of downtown Quahog, a parking structure, an active construction site, and at least one functioning restaurant. The fight lasted several minutes of screen time, employed a level of animation detail far above the show's standard, ended with Ernie apparently dying from his injuries, and then, because the show has never let a good thing go, was revealed to have been survived when Ernie appeared again in a later season. Ernie has appeared in fights with Peter across multiple episodes. Each fight escalates beyond the previous one in scope and destruction. They have fought across moving trains, through skyscrapers, and through construction sites that somehow always happen to be nearby. Each fight ends with apparent resolution, usually with one of them apparently dead or incapacitated, and then Ernie returns for the next one with no explanation of his survival. The chicken fights are a running paradox of consequence. They are among the most destructive events that regularly occur in Quahog. They cause visible casualties and widespread property damage. They are observed by other characters, and then they are forgotten. Nobody in Quahog seems particularly alarmed that Peter Griffin periodically engages in a multi-block brawl with an oversized chicken. Nobody has tried to arrest Ernie. Nobody has tried to restrain Peter. The insurance companies of Quahog must be in some kind of permanent crisis. But the deeper paradox of Ernie is one of origin and nature. What is the giant chicken? The show has, over the years, provided small pieces of his backstory. He has a wife. He has a life outside of the fights. He is, in every context except his interactions with Peter, an ordinary resident of Quahog who happens to be an enormous anthropomorphic chicken capable of violence that would shatter bones and crush organs in any realistic accounting of physics. In Back to the Pilot, when time runs backwards and the chicken fight from that episode reverses, we see what it would look like if the damage from those fights was undone buildings reassembling, cars being uncrashed, the destruction resolving back into the calm it preceded. It is played for laughs, but it is also the show acknowledging that those fights are a form of catastrophe that the universe simply absorbs and resets. The giant chicken is not a paradox because he keeps coming back to life, exactly, though that is strange enough on its own terms. He is a paradox because he represents a specific kind of consequence, enormous, visible, impossible to ignore, in the moment that the show consistently chooses not to carry forward. He is the most dramatic illustration of the show's approach to damage. Huge while it's happening, gone when it's over, and yet he himself remains. Episode after episode, year after year, Ernie the Giant Chicken is still out there somewhere in Quahog, living his life, married, going about his business. And somewhere on the other side of town, Peter Griffin is doing the same. And eventually the show will bring them back together for another fight, and Quahog will absorb the damage, and the reset button will be pressed, and both of them will survive, and nothing will have changed. This might be the most honest metaphor the show has ever produced, without intending to. Some conflicts don't resolve. Some antagonisms cycle. Some damage gets rebuilt, again and again, because the underlying cause of the damage is never addressed. Peter never apologizes for the coupon. Ernie never stops giving out expired coupons, presumably. The cycle continues because the people inside it haven't changed and have no particular desire to. The giant chicken fight is a paradox. It is also, read a certain way, a comedy about the stubbornness that keeps people locked in patterns they could walk away from. Section 13. The Paradox of the Unheard Voice. For most of Family Guy's run, one of the show's most consistent background mysteries has been the question of who can hear Stewie. In the early seasons, the answer appeared to be clear: almost nobody. The adults in the show heard Stewie as a baby babbling the typical pre-verbal sounds of an infant. Brian was the notable exception, and Brian's ability to understand Stewie was treated as part of what made their relationship special. It was Brian who could engage with Stewie as an intellectual equal. Everyone else simply smiled at what appeared to be incomprehensible baby sounds. This created a specific kind of comedy. Stewie would deliver elaborate, sophisticated, threatening monologues about world domination, about the specific methods he planned to use to eliminate his enemies, about his philosophical position on the nature of evil, and the person standing next to him would respond to the baby sounds he appeared to be making with something like, "Oh, he's hungry." The gap between what Stewie was saying and what other characters heard was the whole joke. But the show has never been consistent about this, and the inconsistency has expanded over the seasons into something that now resembles a genuine narrative impossibility. There are episodes where other characters clearly respond to Stewie's words directly. Various one-episode characters have responded to him. The show's own creator, Seth MacFarlane, has described it in interviews as something he leaves deliberately ambiguous. The show is not committed to a single answer about who understands the baby and who doesn't. This ambiguity is, from a comedy writing perspective, enormously practical. It means the show can use either version of the dynamic when needed. When the joke requires that nobody understands Stewie, nobody understands him. When the joke requires that someone responds to what he's saying, that person hears him. The logic shifts based on what the scene needs. But it creates a genuine paradox when you try to apply it consistently. If Stewie has been building time machines in his room and using them to travel through history, and if most of the people in his house can't hear what he says, how has nobody noticed the time machine? Or the laser guns? Or the mind control device from the first season? These are not subtle objects. They are sitting in a nursery in a two-story house on a suburban street. Lois goes into Stewie's room to tuck him in, to change his diaper, to bring him formula. She has been in that room thousands of times. She has never meaningfully reacted to the time machine. One episode, Throw It Away, actually addresses this when Lois finds what she believes to be a piece of junk in Stewie's room and tries to remove it during a decluttering session, the implication being that she has encountered Stewie's technology but doesn't recognize it as technology. She assumes it's a toy or a piece of trash. The episode resolves the potential discovery as a near miss, with Stewie's secret staying intact. This is the show's best attempt at explaining the paradox. Lois sees the time machine but doesn't understand what it is. It doesn't look like a time machine to someone who doesn't expect to see one. She sees junk and treats it as junk. The invisibility of Stewie's inventions is not because nobody enters the room, but because nobody who enters the room has the conceptual framework to understand what they're seeing. That is actually a fairly sophisticated explanation, but it doesn't fully account for the many moments when Stewie's technology has been functional and visually obvious. The weather control device from the first season, the mind control helmet, the various weapons. At some point, a responsible parent would notice that their infant has weapons in his room. The answer the show silently provides is that the floating timeline doesn't just apply to ages and history, it applies to consequences. Lois has encountered the weapons many times in a real accounting of the show's history, but each episode resets. She doesn't carry forward the memory of what she saw in Stewie's room last week, because last week doesn't exist in the way this week exists. She is always encountering him fresh. The paradox of the unheard voice is really the paradox of Stewie's secret in general. The secret has been kept for 25 years, not because he is good at hiding it, but because the universe of the show has agreed not to notice it. The secret is safe because the show needs it to be safe. And Stewie, in his nursery, with his blueprints and his return pad and his various devices of uncertain purpose, has the run of the house in a way that his parents would find horrifying if they ever truly saw it. They won't. They never do. The secret is eternal. Section 14, Lois and the Inconsistent Heart. Of all the paradoxes in Family Guy, the one least often discussed is the one surrounding Lois Griffin. Lois was introduced as the reasonable one. the emotionally stable center of a household that had very little emotional stability anywhere else. She was the character who got through to Peter when nobody else could. She was the patient one, the loving one, the one who saw through the chaos to the people inside it. In the early seasons, she was the most clearly drawn character on the show, not because she was the most original, but because she was the most consistently human. She loved her family. She worried about her family. She tried, with limited success, to hold things together. And then the show started doing what it did to all its characters. It pulled at specific threads until the original fabric was unrecognizable. The contradictions in Lois's character are extensive and strange. She has been established, in different episodes, as a former wild party girl who had a promiscuous past before Peter. She has also been established as someone who had a relatively sheltered upper-class upbringing under the thumb of her wealthy, controlling father, Carter Pewterschmidt. These backstories are not incompatible on their face. People can have both a sheltered childhood and a rebellious young adulthood, but the show deploys them inconsistently enough that they produce different characters depending on the episode. She has been depicted as a genuinely loving mother and as a woman who resents certain aspects of motherhood in ways she tries not to examine too closely. She has been depicted as sexually adventurous and as sexually conservative. She has responded to Peter's most extreme behaviors with warmth and with cold fury, sometimes within the same episode. She has been generous and she has been withholding, empathetic and cruel, patient and explosive. The show would say these are all facets of the same complex person, and there is truth in that. Real people contain multitudes. Real people are inconsistent. Real people are sometimes warm and sometimes cold depending on what's happening to them. But the Lois paradox is different from ordinary human complexity, because the inconsistencies in her character aren't drawn from a coherent center. They emerge from different writers in different seasons with different ideas about who she is, writing for different jokes that require different versions of her. The complexity is the accidental depth produced by 2 decades of people writing the same character without a stable shared vision of what that character is. The most striking version of the Lois paradox is in her relationship with Meg. In the early seasons, Lois was Meg's mother in a real and functional sense. She worried about Meg. She tried to help Meg. When Peter said something hurtful to Meg, Lois pushed back. The relationship between them was warm enough that Meg's struggles at school felt genuinely painful because you understood that she had at least one person at home who cared about her. As the show progressed and the treatment of Meg escalated into something harder and less comfortable, Lois went along with it. She became part of the pattern of contempt rather than a counterweight to it. Her warmth toward Meg faded. In later seasons, she has occasionally been as cold toward her oldest daughter as Peter is, sometimes colder. The woman who was supposed to be the loving, grounding presence in a chaotic home became one of the sources of the chaos. The paradox of Lois is the paradox of all long-running characters in shows without strong continuity. She is whoever the current episode needs her to be. She is the anchor when the episode needs an anchor. She is the accomplice when the episode needs an accomplice. She is the voice of reason and the voice of cruelty, and the long-suffering wife and the woman with her own hidden depths, often in the same season, sometimes in the same episode. She plays piano beautifully, and it is almost always mentioned in her introductions and almost never shown. She is a trained musician who married a man who doesn't know what most instruments are, and that fact was once a source of gentle comedy about incompatibility and unexpected love. Now it is mostly background information. The paradox of Lois, at its most distilled, is this. She started as the show's most carefully written original character and became its most conveniently inconsistent ongoing character. She started as the most human person in the Griffin house and slowly became the most available one available for whatever the episode needed, pulled in whatever direction the joke required, reset each week to a state of readiness for whatever came next. She is also, somewhere underneath all the inconsistency, still the woman who first walked into the show. Playing piano, waiting for Peter to come home, patient in the way that people are patient when they have decided that the life they chose is the life they are going to live. The show has never quite figured out what to do with that woman over the long term, but she is still there, playing piano in a scene that barely anyone notices, in a house full of paradoxes, being the truest version of herself in the moments when nobody is watching. Section 15. The Many Deaths of Quahog. There is another layer of paradox in Family Guy that doesn't get discussed as much as the time travel or the multiverse, but which is just as interesting when you start looking for it. The town of Quahog itself has been destroyed, partially destroyed, or fundamentally altered so many times that its continued existence is a minor miracle of narrative will. Quahog has been hit by natural disasters. It has been invaded. It has been the site of nuclear threats, alien encounters, disease outbreaks, and at least one full-scale medieval siege. In alternate timelines, as seen in Back to the Pilot, it has been vaporized by nuclear attack. In Road to the Multiverse, there is a version of it frozen solid in an ice age and another version that is a post-World War III wasteland. In the main timeline, a satellite crashed into it in one episode. The town has flooded. It has burned. And every single time, by the next episode it is fine. The crater is gone. The satellite has been removed. The flood has receded. The fire has been put out. Quahog resets as completely as its residents do, the neighborhood absorbing catastrophe with the same blithe resilience that Peter absorbs a broken leg. This is, technically, physically impossible. A town that has experienced even a fraction of what Quahog has experienced would be unlivable. The infrastructure alone, water, electricity, road surfaces, would have been destroyed and repaired so many times that the economic cost would have been staggering. The insurance situation in Quahog must be extraordinary. The property values on Spooner Street, given that the street has been in the path of multiple disasters, should have collapsed long ago. No rational person would continue to live in a neighborhood with this track record. But the residents of Quahog are not rational people. They are cartoon characters in a floating timeline, and the town they live in floats with them, resetting as needed, always ready for the next episode's catastrophe. What makes this interesting as a paradox rather than just a production convenience is the episode Back to the Pilot, where the alternate timeline shows a version of America that has been permanently changed by one event, 9/11 being prevented while in the main timeline. Events far more destructive than 9/11 in terms of local impact have had no lasting effect on the community. The show is selective about which consequences it lets stick. National political history apparently matters and will generate permanent alternate timelines. But a nuclear satellite crashing into your town center is just a Tuesday. Mayor Adam West presided over the town through all of this, as the eccentric mayor of Quahog, voiced by Adam West for 17 seasons. His death was handled differently from other Quahog events. It was treated as permanent, a real goodbye to a real person who had provided the character's voice. The show retired Mayor West rather than resetting him, because you cannot reset a real human being's absence. His successor, Wild Wild West, voiced by Sam Elliott, took over the mayoral role. The town, in other words, can absorb the impossible without consequence, but the death of the person who gave voice to its most eccentric official required something genuine. The paradox of Quahog is also the paradox of the show itself. Cartoon logic applies to everything except the things that are really real. The houses rebuild. The roads repave. The mayor's office is occupied by someone new. And somewhere in the history of the town, beneath all the resets and repairs, there is the foundation of everything that Griffin Peterson built. The 17th century English gentleman who founded the whole place after being exiled from England, whose descendant lives above his legacy and drives over it every day on the way to the brewery, with no idea he's there. The founder of the town and the person who unwittingly continues his line are separated by 3 centuries and about 12 feet of Rhode Island topsoil. That is the oldest paradox in Quahog. Not time travel, not alternate universes, not a baby who created the Big Bang, just a man who lived a long time ago, who built a town, whose blood runs in the family that now occupies the town he built, and who is as forgotten as every other piece of the show's history that accumulates and then dissolves. Quahog will survive. It always does. And it will never quite remember what it survived. Section 16. The show that watches itself. Somewhere between all the time machines and the alternate universes and the impossible ages and the impossible origins, there is a simpler and stranger paradox running through Family Guy that only becomes visible if you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. The show has become, in its later seasons, increasingly self-aware. Characters break the fourth wall. Peter talks directly to the audience. Episodes reference the show's own declining ratings. The writers make jokes about the writers. A character in one episode remarks that whatever they're doing probably isn't funny, which is a joke, but it's also a kind of honesty. The show acknowledges explicitly that it knows what it looks like from the outside. In Back to the Pilot, the alternate future version of Family Guy is a lazy CGI show where the cutaway gags don't work properly. The characters in that future version of the show are clearly worse off, flatter, less interesting, cheaper in every sense. The episode presents a dystopian version of the show as a warning, or perhaps as a joke about warnings. It is hard to be sure which, and that ambiguity might be the point. In Cutaway Land, Peter and Lois discover they can enter the world of the show's cutaway gags, the random, disconnected vignettes that are the show's most famous stylistic device. They travel between them, experiencing gags from inside. The episode uses recycled cutaways from previous seasons, which is either meta-clever or just economical depending on how generous you're feeling, and probably both. The show knows it uses cutaways. The show knows that audiences have noticed how many cutaways there are. The show makes jokes about this while continuing to use cutaways at the same rate it always has. This is a meta-paradox. Knowing something and acknowledging it out loud doesn't change it. The show can be aware of its own patterns without breaking them. Self-awareness and self-correction are genuinely different things, and the show demonstrates that difference every week. Brian, in later seasons, becomes our mouthpiece for political views that are clearly the writer's own. The show knows this is happening. Quagmire's famous speech in Jerome is the New Black calls Brian out for exactly this, and the audience is clearly meant to agree with Quagmire. The show criticizes Brian's political soapboxing through a character in the show, and then Brian continues to soapbox in subsequent episodes because the critique changed nothing. The show corrected itself in fiction while repeating the behavior in reality. This is a different kind of paradox from the time travel ones, but it might be the most interesting one. It is the paradox of a show that has become sophisticated enough to observe itself, but not sophisticated enough or not motivated enough to change based on what it observes. The meta-awareness is real. The self-knowledge is genuine, and yet it produces no different outcome than ignorance would have. Stewie and Brian in Back to the Pilot vote on whether to change history. The majority says no. Leave things as they are. The original timeline, with all its flaws and contradictions and accumulated damage, is still the one they choose to live in, not because it is perfect, not because a better version isn't available, but because the version they know, the version they have always been part of, is the version that made them who they are. There is something in that choice that feels true to what the show is, underneath everything. Family Guy is full of paradoxes, full of contradictions, full of things that don't add up and can't be reconciled. And yet there it is, every week, choosing to be exactly itself rather than the cleaned-up, consistent, dramatically coherent thing it could theoretically have become. The characters don't age. The timeline floats. The universe was created by a baby. The dog died and didn't. The town rebuilds. The pilot episode contains errors. The cutaway gags go on too long. The show knows all of this. And every week, from the Griffin house on Spooner Street in the fictional town frozen in Rhode Island Amber, the light is on. The family is home. Peter is doing something inadvisable. Lois is patient and then not. Meg is trying. Chris is trying in a different way. Stewie is in his crib, building something the rest of the house doesn't know about. And Brian is downstairs with a martini, reading or pretending to read, keeping his own counsel. The time machine is upstairs. The multiverse is one remote click away. History is always available for revision, and none of it changes what this is. A family, in a house, in a neighborhood that never changes, going through the same ordinary chaos they have always gone through. The paradoxes don't resolve, they accumulate. They layer over each other like the sediment that builds a riverbed, each one distinct, each one the product of a specific episode in a specific season written by specific people for a specific joke, but all of them together forming something that is more than the sum of its contradictions. A show with the impossible permanence of a neighborhood that has been there forever and will be there forever, even though it couldn't possibly be. The light is on. They're home. And somewhere, in a room upstairs, a 1-year-old baby who created the universe is wide awake, making plans. Conclusion: the dream logic of Spooner Street. There is a question that runs underneath everything in this video. one that was never asked directly, but that everything else has been circling. What does it mean to fall asleep to Family Guy? The show is not calming in the way that nature documentaries are calming, or in the way that slow music is calming. It is fast, chaotic, loud, and frequently surprising. It contains paradoxes on top of paradoxes, timelines that contradict each other, characters who are never quite the same person twice, a baby who created the universe, a dog who died and didn't, a town that rebuilds itself from catastrophe every single week. And yet people do fall asleep to it. Millions of people. Late at night, with the television on, drifting off to the sound of the Griffin family going about their impossible, contradictory, eternally resetting lives. There might be something in the paradoxes themselves that makes this work. The floating timeline means that nothing accumulates. You cannot get behind. You cannot miss something critical. Every episode is complete in itself, and the version of the show you fall asleep to is exactly as valid as the version you would have watched if you'd stayed awake. Nothing carries forward, nothing is lost. The reset button is always pressed. This is, in a sense, what sleep itself does. It resets the accumulation of the day. It returns you, more or less, to a baseline. You wake up having processed and released what needed to be processed and released, and you face a new day that rhymes with yesterday but is not identical to it. The eternal present of Spooner Street rhymes with the eternal present of waking up. The same faces, the same house, the same neighborhood. Whatever happened yesterday has been absorbed, and the day is beginning again. Stewie is in his crib. He is always in his crib. He is 1 year old, and he has been 1 year old for 25 years of your television viewing life, and he will be 1 year old for as long as the show exists. He has a time machine in the corner. He has plans. He has knowledge of the Big Bang's origin that most physicists would give significant career achievements to possess. He has been to the Renaissance and to the end of time and to dozens of parallel universes. He is the most traveled being in Quahog, perhaps in the universe he accidentally created, and he is in a onesie, in a crib, 1 year old, still. Brian is downstairs with a martini going warm on the coffee table beside him. He has been alive and dead in the same continuity. He has contradictory origin stories and an age that changes by episode. He has been the show's most beloved character and its most criticized one. He has made mistakes so large they threaten causality itself, and been forgiven by the people who loved him anyway. He is asleep on the couch, probably. A book open on his chest that he was pretending to read. Peter is wherever Peter is. In bed, probably, or in the kitchen at some inadvisable hour doing something that will have consequences tomorrow and no consequences the episode after that. He is 40-something and 60-something simultaneously. Born in Mexico and raised in Massachusetts, the founding father of Quahog and its most oblivious current resident. He is the main character of the show and the one the show has treated most dramatically over the years, stripped of his original gentleness and rebuilt into something harder, and eventually, in the later seasons, softened again towards something resembling where he started. Outside on Spooner Street, it is whatever time it is. The neighborhood is the neighborhood it has always been. The houses are unchanged. The trees are at exactly the height they need to be. The sky is the right color for whatever moment you are in. The paradoxes are sleeping. They will wake up again in the next episode, or the next time you press play, or the next time you follow a thread of thought too far and find yourself unable to explain how Stewie can be 1 year old for 25 years, or why Brian has 2 incompatible origin stories, or why the universe needed a baby from Rhode Island to have existed at all. But for now, they are quiet. The impossible house is still. The Griffin family is at rest in the way that cartoon families are at rest, not accumulating anything, not building toward anything, just being what they are in the particular present they inhabit. The paradox of Family Guy is that it is a show about time passing, about time reversed, about time traveled and manipulated and created and destroyed that refuses to let time actually do anything to the people at its center. They are preserved in amber. They are eternal. They are the people they were when we first met them, and they will be those people in 25 more years, still in that house, still on that street. And there is something in that, something in the idea of a family that time cannot touch, a neighborhood that resets to itself, a universe that loops back to its beginning that is, when you stop fighting it and let yourself be in it, genuinely restful. The time machine is in the corner, the remote is on the shelf, The multiverse is one click away. Sleep well. If you enjoyed spending this time in the paradoxes of Quahog, please subscribe. It costs you nothing and it means everything to a channel like this. Like the video if you made it to the end, or if you fell asleep and just woke up to this conclusion. Leave a comment. Which paradox surprised you most? Which one are you still thinking about as you close your eyes? Until the next one, good night. One last thing before you go, if you're still here. The most interesting thing about all of these paradoxes, the age paradox, the time machine paradox, the Big Bang paradox, the death that wasn't a death, the origin stories that don't match, the town that rebuilds after everything, is that none of them are accidental. Not exactly. They are the byproduct of a show that was built to be renewable. The floating timeline, the reset button, the self-contained episodes, all of it was designed, consciously or not, to let the show keep going indefinitely. Every paradox is a joint where two episodes that didn't need to agree with each other met without bothering to shake hands. The writers of any given episode were writing their episode, not the whole history. The continuity editors who existed in the show's early years were eventually outpaced by the volume of content being produced. The paradoxes accumulated not because anyone wanted them to, but because nobody had the time to prevent them. And once they were there, once Stewie had been 1 year old for 5 seasons and 10 seasons and 15, the paradox became load-bearing. You couldn't age him without breaking the premise. You couldn't give Brian a single coherent origin without contradicting half a dozen episodes. You couldn't resolve the floating timeline without ending the show. So the paradoxes stayed and became, over enough time and enough thinking about them, their own kind of lore, their own kind of depth. A show that was never trying to be mythologically consistent accidentally created a mythology that people spend hours and years exploring. That is its own paradox, and maybe the most remarkable one of all. A show that didn't care about its own continuity produced, through that very indifference, more genuine mystery and more genuine engagement than many shows that cared about almost nothing else. Spooner Street doesn't change, the Griffin family doesn't age, the time machine is always in the corner. And the conversation about all of it, this conversation, the one you've been part of tonight, keeps going as long as people are watching, which they are, millions of them. Right now, somewhere in the world at whatever time it is, someone is watching Family Guy and not thinking about any of this, just laughing. And someone else is thinking about all of it, very seriously, at 2 in the morning, and finding that the thinking is its own strange kind of comfort. Both of those people are right. The paradox contains multitudes. Sleep well, really.